Pagitt and Mark Stoddard. Mark was a pastor, worked at a church for a long time, and then made the mistake of standing up against Trumpism and Christian nationalism and was shown the door. Unfortunately, it's an all too familiar story where when you confront Christian nationalism, there's often consequences within the church. But I think you'll find his story inspiring. Maybe this is something you've had to wrestle with in your own life. In what ways do you stand up to Christian nationalism in your own workplace, in your own churches? It can get messy, but we hope this conversation will be encouraging. So let's dive into it.
All right. Hey, Mark. So good to have you on the podcast today. As you know, we're doing a lot of work here at Vote Common Good to try to tell the stories of Christian nationalism, both the story historically, but more importantly, what's happening right now. And you, my friend, are someone who has a story that is about the right now of what's happening. There are times where Christian nationalism is hidden and where it's the narrative that's functioning behind the scenes. And then there are times where it's right out in front and people are glad to talk about it. Congress people like Marjorie Taylor Greene will sell shirts on their website that say proud Christian nationalist. Churches will stand up and say, we are glad to embrace a narrative that calls for a particular kind of nationalism rooted in the Christian narrative and has to do with politics and faith and all. And you've had an experience and a history in one of those. So thanks for telling us that story. Tell us what happened. Give us the story. And I'll tell you, around here we love the details. So be as deep in the weeds and backstory as you're comfortable talking about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. We appreciate the work you guys are doing and that we've connected with you through some other like-minded people who are concerned about this movement. So just kind of we'll give quick context to kind of how we were, I guess, confronted with Christian nationalism that we didn't have language for when it happened. We were like a little bit broadsided by it. And as you said, it was kind of maybe hidden or under the surface, and then it became very open to us. So we're in Phoenix, Arizona. I was the performing arts director at a large megachurch in Phoenix called Dream City Church. It was formerly called Phoenix First Assembly. The lead pastor at the time, when the church was really growing in the 80s and 90s, was Reverend Tommy Barnett. His son then took over in about 2013. The church had always been known for really big outreaches, productions, illustrated sermons, holiday Christmas and Easter shows, and also the Dream Center movement. If you're familiar with that, there's a large Dream Center in Los Angeles. There's also a large one here in Phoenix. And I think they have hundreds of kind of satellite Dream Centers. They're like social justice organizations who are helping people out of prison, out of addictions, out of, people who kind of need a second chance in life. And we supported all of that work, while we were there. So I was there for over 20 years. Luke Barnett, Tommy's son, took over and started to really allow us to grow our program in a huge way. We started really branching out into, we did a big summer musical every year that was a quote unquote secular musical. It was a Disney show or, family friendly musical. And that is my profession. I'm a professional theater artist. So actor, director, playwright. And the church really gave us the platform to be creative, which was pretty unique, especially even looking back now. I was like, wow, it was even more rare than I anticipated. Because we're allowed to broach into a lot of topics that were maybe looked at as a little bit taboo for some
because of the arts, because of the arts side of thing. You mean because people, when they have an arts program at a church, they're like, well, those art people, sure, they'll talk about those things or include those people. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think the bottom line with the arts involved in church, and this is eventually what happened with us too, but for 20 years it was pretty wide open. There was a kind of a conflict of approaches. The arts, in my opinion, should ask questions, and evangelicalism, by its nature, answers questions. And so those things eventually kind of go, hold on, if we're trying to ask questions about the bigger issues in culture or in theology or in justice, a lot of times evangelicalism will come in with a very strong, well, here's the answer. It's very
Yeah.
clear, it's black and white. And I tend to live in a more of a gray world in the arts where you tend to consider other people's choices and highlight their stories and so forth. So, but our program was growing. I mean, I think we probably had the biggest arts program in the nation.
Hmm.
Thousands of people who were involved in our program, from original material that I was writing, short plays, short films. We were doing big Broadway musicals. We were doing, obviously, our holiday productions. Over 150,000 people a year were coming to see our shows. We had
Wow.
a huge auditorium. It's a 3,600 seat auditorium that's kind of built more like a Broadway theater than a
State of the art, I guess.
Yeah.
You probably had in your work life arrangements with animal handlers then, if you're doing some kind of holiday.
Oh yeah. Yep,
Is that true? You were moving animals through that place and for not only petting zoos, but like performance stuff?
Yep, absolutely. Wow. Animals, elephants, camels, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, so
a real circus.
So it was the holiday shows were, we laugh about them, but they were a mix of spectacle and worship and theatrical elements. We had a lot of aerial flying things for flying angels and flying aerial artists and so forth. So yeah, it was very much a spectacle, and that was kind of the philosophy of the church in the 80s and 90s, was like, how can we embrace something big and innovative to draw as many people as we can into to see the show.
And that's a really important subtext to not only what was going on at Dream City Church there in Phoenix, but across a whole movement that's involved in a lot of things that became the political MAGA movement and the Christian nationalist movement, is the belief in dealing with, or not leaning into, the separation that sometimes happens between some parts of culture, right? Like arts and church, or theater and religion, or big spectacle and outreach. Like it's mixing those things together, normally for the purpose of the expansion of the gospel, right? The personal expansion of the gospel, but also kind of the footprint and the attention that Christian activities and Christian call makes. So you all weren't just doing spectacle for the sake of art, right? You were doing it with the intention that it would spread the story. And I think that becomes important because there's people who think that Christian nationalism wants to destroy Christianity, because a lot of us are warning about the threat of it to Christianity. But the adherents to it believe that it's especially this new version of Christian nationalism that I think the church you were involved in, some of the other leaders there, are really on the forefront of. There's some of the current leaders in this. Yeah. They see it as the future of Christianity, like a blending of state and personal religion is a way forward. I think if you're speaking generously from what they say and how they say it, that's what they're talking about. And so this conversation we're having about what you did in the church and all, and how it sort of postured itself, I think it's super helpful for people to understand that that's a perspective that wasn't just engaged because of Christian nationalism. That's an overall perspective of this kind of church and church work.
Yeah. And I think again, my background was in more professional theater and educational theater. So mixing my experience, and I was a Christian in those environments. But when I got involved with the church, it was definitely, for lack of a better word, it was propaganda. So what you are creating, the messaging, whether it's artistic or through a sermon or a worship song or a testimony video that might be used, it's all gearing towards the final altar call,
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
which you brought attention to, soul winning for Dream City Church and many what might be called charismatic churches is kind of a number one end game for them, of saying we will do whatever we can to influence our community and get people in the door to hear the gospel message, and not that let them leave without hearing an altar call or a presentation of the gospel message with an opportunity for people to respond right then and there, to make their
Yeah.
decision. So the goal of the church was to use everything that they were doing: sports ministry, arts ministry, the Dream Center movement was all part of that soul winning effort. I did make a plea with them when we started doing our summer musicals. I asked that we not do any gospel presentation. It is just simply something for our community to come and enjoy. And it became hugely successful and actually very profitable. So
Hmm.
they started to see that and go, okay, this idea is bringing a lot of people who would never come to another religious
Yeah.
event.
Yeah.
And we had a ton of people involved in our program too, who had wanted nothing to do with religion or church membership, but they knew my wife and I, and were like, hey, we love being a part of shows that you guys produce. We're going to come over and be a part of your
Sure.
summer music. This is a side note, but it became actually kind of a sticking point. There was a large LGBTQ population who were involved in our performances, and we took no discriminatory activity towards anybody being involved. That was our philosophy. We wanted to be open, affirming. This is a place where if you like to do theater, come on, join in. You're a
Hmm.
designer, you're an actor, you're a technician, you're a musician, whatever it is. And those people started to find a home, with this kind of, it was like a community theater activity for them. But there were members in the church who expressed a lot of concern. One in particular that I remember getting an email that they were very, very disappointed that we were turning over our altar to the godless homosexuals, who were
Hmm.
simply playing a role in a show. They were not saying anything about their lifestyle or theological. It was like they were an actor in a performance, but
Hmm.
the people maybe knew that they were openly gay or had a lifestyle that may not jive with traditional conservative values.
Hmm.
Um, there were some bumps in the road with that, but Luke and the leadership always backed us. They were like, "Nope, let's keep doing it." So I was encouraged to go, "Hey, maybe we are creating an environment where we can have broader conversations than maybe the traditional narrow
Hmm.
viewpoint of theology." And not that I was out to change the world, and say, hey, let's, but it was like my little part of the world, and
Yep.
going, can we create a more inclusive, open-minded environment here? And it was going pretty well for a few years with that. There were a couple
And
bumps.
then something started to change, or then there was a
Yeah,
moment. How did the
there were
because that's not
two.
that's not the way it is for you now. Obviously, something's
Yeah,
changed, and
yeah.
Christian nationalism has taken root there.
There was it was right about, I think it was during the 2016 election campaign process. Luke, we were doing a series in church, which we do a lot of series. It's a 4 to 6 week, a certain theme. And I usually was in charge of producing any of the creative elements for that, whether it was a short live theater drama piece or a short film or something to kind of bring that out. So we were talking about this series that we were going to do. And Luke kept bringing up a phrase that he was using a few times that kind of made me scratch my head a little bit. And he said, "We want to make Arizona a Christian state." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Obviously,
Hmm.
the alignment with "Make America Great Again" was a little concerning to me. But as I tried to kind of drill down on that and unpack it with him, I was like, "So basically, what you're saying is you want Dream City to be a church that serves our community." Right? We're looking for opportunities to serve our community through the arts, through the outreach of like the Dream Center, through there's a big outreach to human trafficking. I mean, some really great stuff going on. And I said, "You're not like talking about getting involved in politics, right?" And he was like, "Oh no, we're talking about getting involved in politics." And I kind of went, "Oh, okay." That was never on the radar up until that point. It didn't really surface for a few more years. And so I kind of always thought that was a strange approach that he was taking. And I even said facetiously in one of those meetings, it was the leadership kind of core in that. And I said, "I usually like to think from a person's point of view who is not a Christian, has no religious context, who comes to visit our church, how will they view our messaging?" And I would often, just bring up observations or maybe challenge certain things. And I said, this does not seem like a messaging phrase, "Let's make Arizona a Christian state," that is going to resonate well with people for that. For instance, how would you guys feel, talking to the leadership group, if the mosque down the street said, "We're going to make Arizona a Muslim state"? And they literally like laughed and they were like, "That'll never happen." Ha ha ha. We would never. And I kind of was like, "Are you not seeing the irony here of like
Yeah.
what you're messaging? If it was, we're going to serve Arizona or we're going to, but make Arizona a Christian state implied conquest, implied bullying tactics, implied all kinds of things that were like, we're going to make you line up with our ideologies."
Into something you're not already. Yep.
Yeah. Knowing the people we had in our arts community, I was like, "Oh, this is not going to fly well with how they're going to view this." So I always kind of had that on my radar. Jump forward in June of 2020, we got an email. Again, this is about 2 weeks after the George Floyd murder. So the Black Lives Matter movement is going across the globe, literally. There's protest marches in almost every major city, certainly in Arizona. I participated in several of those with my children, and we walked there. Got some reprimands from some of the leadership about being involved in that. But so that was high on the radar. Arizona was at a spike in COVID. So there was a lot of messaging and concern about having any public events. As a matter of fact, no public events were allowed to happen in Arizona at that time. Churches were shut down. Anything over 50 people, I think, had been kind of deemed as, not allowed. So we get this email, and the church had started to align with a guy who I had no idea what his name was, never heard him before, but you probably have heard of him. His name is Charlie Kirk, and he runs Turning Point USA, which is based out of Phoenix. I had no idea who he was because I don't typically listen to conservative media and certainly right-wing media. He showed up at our church in, I think it was April. It was about Easter time. And, President Trump had said all churches are going to open by Easter time.
Easter. Yeah, I remember
and
that.
So Dream City was kind of posturing to get ready to open back up. And we actually had a test service where all the staff were called in to come and get ready to go through all the COVID protocols to get people in safely, wearing masks. So they were, doing a decent job on that. But there was somebody in the audience that day who I had never known. And he posted Instagram post or something afterward. My wife's best friend from Pennsylvania said, "Oh my gosh, Charlie Kirk was at your church today. That's so awesome." We're like,
Wow.
Who's Charlie Kirk? But he had posted a short thing and said, "Church is essential, and don't let the tyrants close us down," something to that effect. And we were like, what do you mean tyrants? Like, we hadn't heard that messaging before. This was in about April. In June, jumping forward again, the staff got an email that Turning Point USA was going to be hosting a rally at Dream City Church using our auditorium as a third-party vendor, so to speak, of renting it out. And their special guest was going to be the President of the United States. So we were like, oh, this is concerning to us. And is this a good idea during literally his photo op in front of St. John's Church with the Bible was like a week before this. So
wow.
There's a lot going on. And and so we, we had that concern about it being polarizing and kind of tone deaf to kind of the current social tensions that were going on. And again, there was a spike in COVID, but the governor, Ducey, who was a Republican, overturned that for a day so that the rally could happen at Dream City.
Yeah, so that's an important place to pause. I remember when that happened, that the governor basically put in a reprieve of COVID precautions for one day, a Saturday maybe or something like that. I don't remember what day of the week.
I think it was on if I remember right, it might have been like a Tuesday or a Wednesday or so. I can't remember the exact day, honestly. June 23rd, 2020. Actually, I remember the date.
You remember the date. There you go. Yeah. So June 23rd.
Kind of went, whoa, what's happening here?
Yeah, that's one of those moments that you recall. And so you start to see that the workings of a church as a rental facility, but partnered with the message, connected with the then President of the United States. Now, this is a thing that people get uncomfortable hearing, past, presidents at churches and so on. But it's not unusual in some church traditions, the Black church, for pastors to go or for presidents to go and speak and maybe even be there on a Sunday in a church service. So this is a thing that does happen. It's part of the American political sort of system. But this one was different. This was a Turning Point USA. And if people are not familiar with that group, you might want to be. If you know anything of Christian nationalism, you would know the messaging of Turning Point USA. Yeah. And it's been interesting, Mark, as I've spent time talking about the new variants of not only the COVID virus, but the new variants of Christian nationalism. I think of your story frequently. And one of the characteristics of the new variant was fueled by COVID. And it really was this thing that you said Charlie Kirk put out in April, which was the declaration and the argument when we're going to decide what's essential in the United States, because we're going to have now categories of essential and therefore non-essential, both workers and, and it has a trickle down. Who gets the vaccine when vaccines came out, all these kinds of things. Some states have paid extra money for essential workers and, to back up PPP loans and other things. So it's a big deal. The designation that religious communities were not seen as essential elements to society is a real organizing point for the new movement of Christian nationalism. Like, you can't be around new variant Christian nationalists, which I think Dream City Church and others are part of, without someone bringing this up, right? Yeah. So, and it's a really, I was a pastor at that time, and am still now, and I get it. That's a very worthwhile conversation. There was no conversation whether churches should be determined to be essential or not, right? Like, the Walmart is open, but churches aren't, and all kinds. And there's lots of arguments about what you do in churches and how long you stay and what you said. The curious thing was we didn't really have that conversation as a society. So my suggestion to people when they're in a conversation with Christian nationalists or Christian nationalist sympathizing people is just to ask them what they think about this and to hear them out. Now, I would have concluded I don't think churches need to be essential for meetings. I think there's other ways they can do it, and they can follow all the same protocols of restaurants and everything else, and churches figured it out. But it's a worthwhile conversation. Do you think, like, when you were there and you heard that, and you're somebody whose livelihood was connected to a church, and there was no way Dream City Church was going to do it like a drive-through or small groups of 20 people or less.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about that fundamental question that it sits at the heart of so much of the new energy around Christian nationalism and the resistance to any government protocols around COVID? And granting, so many of these same people are also just COVID impact deniers. Like, just, they don't think COVID was that dangerous or that deadly, and they don't wear masks. And, I have a number of friends that are in that category. So granting that that's also the case, but this thing about churches and being essential or not, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I've gone back over this a lot. Like, what attracted Dream City to Turning Point USA? Because that was the flashpoint that happened. That Dream City saw somebody who was aligned in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlie Kirk had incredible political activism influence, especially on social media with young people. So that they found each other in this storm. But what was happening at Dream City earlier, and this was in messaging for many, many, many years with Tommy Barnett and his son Luke, is that the local church, I mean, I heard them say this 1,000 times, the local church is the answer for society's problems. And when they say the local church, they're not talking about the Catholic Church down the street. They're not talking about the Lutheran Church. They're talking about their version of truth,
True
so to
churches,
speak, that is the full gospel, whatever kind of speaking points they need to kind of ascribe to. And that always felt really arrogant to me. I was like, I don't know. I grew up in the Methodist Church. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and they had some really great ways of viewing certain things that I still ascribe to. I know friends who are diehard Catholics, and they love society and they love God, So this idea that the local church, evangelical church, is the sole answer for society's ills never really sat well with me. But it also didn't become a big, issue either. So that was a message that was very prevalent in the church congregation. So they're already going, of course we are essential. We are the sole dispensary of truth and justice to our community. And if we're not allowed to operate, then what's going to happen? We are going to be overrun by the liberal woke mob.
So well said.
We will, the greater community will suffer if we are not able to operate in the full expression of who we are. Charlie Kirk is talking about this same type of thing from a little bit of a different stance. And then they found each other. And I was not aware at the time how influenced Luke Barnett and his wife Angel had been by Charlie Kirk, especially when it came to their campus programs. If you're not familiar with Turning Point, they started out as basically a group that was trying to influence young conservatives on campuses and targeting specifically liberal professors and publicizing them and kind of asking the conservative young people to call these liberal professors out and shame them and name them publicly. And so that was kind of their start, and they have millions of followers with that. They grew on to much more political activism. They're very close with, he became very close to the Trumps, and had, enormous influence with that. Their fundraising has grown astronomically. They're just really, really well connected and influential. And that's probably my biggest takeaway is like, if your church is connected to, as a matter of fact, Dream City, after all of this, after we resigned, which I can tell you a little bit about that, but
yeah, please do.
They they determined that Turning Point USA is now an extension ministry of Dream City Church. That they are going to, and that's where this Turning Point faith started. So it was a whole nother opportunity for Turning Point to go. And I'm a little, I'll admit it, I'm a little bit biased about this, but I think they found a whole nother gullible crowd to go, oh my gosh, there's a whole pocket of church, not a pocket, a network of thousands and thousands of evangelical churches who have kind of linked on to the Trump MAGA ideology. We can go and create this kind of mix of nationalism, politics, religion, school curriculum, worship. All of these things started to kind of have this weird cocktail that became very much of the evangelical MAGA movement. And Dream City was kind of the first one to go, we're going to host once a month what they called Freedom Night in America. And Charlie Kirk, and usually a guest, some very controversial guests like Sean Foyt, I think is how you pronounce the worship. Fuchs was the worship leader who was going around leading some of these kind of COVID protest worship events. Is really a weird mix of worship, and then somebody would give an altar call, and then they'd take an offering, and then Charlie Kirk would come up and talk about Black Lives Matter movement, anti-CRT, how to raid your school board and protest against them. Certainly the drag queen shows and all of those type of things. Basically, and I had no idea what this group was about, but as you say, try to research them. They're all about culture wars, winning the culture wars. Well, if somebody is always winning, somebody's losing. And losing. Is that good for our society, where one group is trying to bully or exact privilege in the public square when it comes to politics? And I think that's why I really appreciate what you guys are doing, is you're not saying religion shouldn't be a part of it. Yeah, people can have their faith guide their conscience and their steps, but when we are trying to give privilege to one group over another, that's where we need to kind of be really cautious, and groups will try to take advantage of that. And I think Turning Point is really good at that. They're platforming a lot of controversial figures and promoting a lot of weird, kind of conspiracy theories. Certainly embracing the big lie. Gave a huge platform to Carrie Lake in Arizona and Mark Fincham. A weird side story with that, while we're on Carrie Lake, she was very kind of trusted public news anchor for years. I knew Carrie Lake at a couple of events that I had been involved with over the years. Seemed like a really kind of grounded, wonderful woman. She left the news industry and picked up the mantle for campaigning. Turning Point jumped all over her with like, oh, here's a MAGA Republican that we can promote in a strange campaign event that Sean Fuchs, is that his name?
I think so.
Was at. He was a worship leader there. The Dream City worship team was there. Charlie Kirk was there. A bunch of other Mark Driscoll was there, who's kind of a controversial evangelical leader. He's replanted here in Scottsdale and opened a church. After that event happened, it was a fundraising campaign event. Tommy Barnett, who is Luke Barnett's father, there's a video that came out on Twitter where they gathered around Carrie Lake, sat her in a chair, and anointed her with oil. This may sound very bizarre, like, wow, that's kind of kooky and creepy. But if you know what the theological origin of anointing somebody with oil, this is like Carrie Lake got this spiritual covering umbrella from an evangelical leader, which was very important to have. And all of the evangelical followers then were like, oh, Carrie Lake is who we are going to fight for and vote for.
Yeah.
And
It's a
so
real religious endorsement when you anoint someone
yeah,
with oil, especially in the charismatic sliver
yes,
of the evangelical movement. Yeah,
yeah. And that
that's
when I saw that, I was like, oh, they've now not only endorsing candidates, they are anointing a candidate. And
literally
this,
anointing. Yes, when people say someone was anointed, that's what they're talking about. Is
yeah,
the use of a religious? It's like baptism for people that don't know the anointing world. It's
yeah. And
baptism
often,
like.
yeah, often anointing was, for leadership or governance roles and even battle roles,
Mhm.
anointing somebody for battle. And I think they have that battle mentality big time. But to anoint somebody who is a clear embracer of a outright lie with the election denial
Yeah.
just made me go, wait a minute, how can you guys look past the obvious but yet still embrace this idea that this woman is going to carry out your best hopes for, um, uh, undergirding all of the conservative Christian beliefs. I mean, I think that's the general head shaking moment that a lot of people had about, like,
Yeah.
how could a Christian embrace Trump? Like, he's antithetical to the messaging of Jesus, isn't he?
Yeah.
And I certainly was going that way too. Um,
We've talked
yeah.
a lot in this podcast about the power of this movement called the Seven Mountains movement in theory.
Yeah.
And it's the one that really sits at the heart of what you're talking about, especially
Hmm.
there at Dream City. And that movement basically says God anoints, finds, appoints leaders in 7 sectors, 7 mountains, to do God's bidding. It's not about how religious that person is, how righteous that person is. It's the filling of a role to accomplish something. It's like a prophetic role that someone sits in. I'm sure that was part of what was going on when you were there, and people would describe it that way, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're not hiring a Sunday school teacher. We're hiring someone to accomplish, the purposes. This Charlie Kirk
Yeah.
you mentioned partnered with Jerry Falwell Jr. and started a whole
Hmm.
center at Liberty University. Falwell Jr., before his own downfall for his own sexual proclivities of watching his wife have sex with a 21-year-old person that they know. Before all that came out, Jerry Falwell was pushing this idea that we need someone who's going to be the mean one to accomplish God's goals.
Yeah.
The punch him in the face kind of leader. That's what we need.
Yeah.
So the way they put all this together, it's not like they're looking past the cruelty. They're looking past the cynicism. They're looking past the sin. They're like, no, we want that person on our side. Like, this is all part of the sign that
Yeah.
this clearly has to be God's person. So when someone like you or someone else says in a staff meeting or to people on a church staff, like, hey, I don't think this is the kind of person, that is met with, you don't understand what's really going on. Because
Yeah.
really going onism is also the subtext to all of this, right? There's always a what's really going on world.
Yeah.
Did you experience that forthrightly? And is that part of what led to your own
Yeah.
recognition that you couldn't stay in this role?
Yeah. Going back on the dominionism or the 7 mountain mandate, also referred to as Christian dominionism in many ways. Luke actually used that as a justification for expanding the arts program and saying one of the things that we should be embracing is being a leader in the arts, and use that as kind of a reference of saying, well, we want to be a leader in education, a leader in media, a leader in the arts. At the time, I kind of was like, okay, didn't really think about it. But then it came back around. Yes, that this idea of the 7 mountain mandate kind of drove a lot of that, and a lot of it is based in fear. Unfortunately, fear that culture and other leaders are woke and they can't properly get a perspective of what's best for culture and society. So yeah, that became a big part. Right before the rally happened in June of 2020, obviously my wife and I had sent our concerning emails to Luke of saying, this could literally jeopardize all the work that Dream City has done over the last 40 years. This is a political powder keg that
this is June of 2020.
Yes. This is when I got the email that in 10 days, President Trump is going to be at our church. I immediately sent him an email with our concerns that it was going to jeopardize, the good work that the church had been doing. Obviously, it felt tone deaf and, a little out of touch with what was happening with the culture. The media in town was really not kind to Dream City for hosting this. And there was a little side note that this went viral. Unfortunately, the lead pastor and the chief financial officer put up a video. I think it was a Instagram message. Maybe it was TikTok. I don't remember. But they claimed that they had an air filtration system installed in the church. This is 2 days before the big event that kills 99% of COVID. So he even said, so you can know that when you walk into our auditorium, COVID, even if it did exist, would be completely eradicated.
Yeah, I remember watching that video and I'm like, what church figured out how to have a filtration system to get rid of the number one virus?
Good old Dream City, yeah. So it turned out to obviously be not true, and it was completely debunked by things, and they walked it back a little bit. They never really apologized for putting misinformation out there. So that was an unfortunate. So all of this is happening within a week of each other, and my world is kind of going, whoa, wait a minute, who are these people?
And obviously you're not even having staff meetings at this point. This is all happening over emails and text because everyone's lives were still that way. Is that the case? Like you weren't sitting face to face talking about this, you were having to write sentences back and forth?
Yeah, and we're having, Zoom staff meetings and so forth. So about 3 days before the event, the Trump event, we have a staff meeting, and Luke goes on about a 30-minute kind of culture war, for lack of a better word, a tirade, and talking about the 7 Mountain Mandate. He hits all of the culture war things, everything from, pro-life militancy to reversing LGBTQ rights, securing conservative Supreme Court justices, viewing the liberals as a woke radical mob that's going to take away our Second Amendment rights and religious freedoms. And he painted this dire picture of spiritual forces that were an existential threat to the church, and concluded by saying, if you are not willing to fight these forces with me and you receive a paycheck from this church, I'm asking for your resignation.
Wow.
And my mouth just kind of hit the ground. I was like, never in my 20 plus years on the staff had I been asked to align with a political ideology. And we basically saw this ultimatum as a loyalty test for allegiance to the lead pastor and a way for them to purge the staff of any dissenting viewpoints. We met with Luke privately, and he showed very little concern for our viewpoint. Like, hey, why do you think this way? Or what are your concerns? He basically kind of avoided that and any of the kind of complex nuances of theology and culture. So, we at that time really had to wrestle. And he also, we had put a Facebook post up that said, because we were getting mountains of emails and text messages from people who were outside of the church community going, what the blank is happening at your church? Of course, it had already been announced publicly that Trump was coming, and it was national news. And we were like, I know, we're not for this, and we don't endorse this. So we put on our Facebook post, we said we normally don't put anything political, and this is not intended for that. But we just wanted everybody to know that even though we work at Dream City and we worship there, we are not endorsing or in support of the organization, Turning Point USA, who is hosting this rally. we got a ton of positive, feedback from people. Thank you for clarifying, blah, blah, blah. And then, there were some from the church who responded, that we should obey our government and all of that type of thing. It was kind of like, whatever. I got a call from Luke about 2 hours later after that and was put on administrative leave for
Wow.
appearing to be disloyal to
Wow.
to the church. And he said, I'm putting you on leave to think about your future at Dream City. And
Wow.
so all this is unraveling quickly. And again, this Christian nationalism that we had, first of all, we didn't even know what to call it. But this thing was surfacing quickly. And so we had to leave. The event happened at Dream City, national media there.
Yep.
Trump was, kind of hitting all of his talking points, and, the crowd was into it, and just seeing kind of the MAGA faithful, come into this event was pretty interesting. I guess I didn't realize how big of a group it was, and how vocal they were and militant they were. So we took Luke up on his ultimatum, and he said, if you're not willing to support these, then I'm asking for your resignation. So about a week later, I'll read a little thing here that we put. We were trying to make a positive, inclusive change from within the church, but it became clear that Dream City leadership was on the Trump train, and it was time for us to jump off. We could no longer in good conscience work for and attend a church that actively sought to suppress any dissenting views, lacked cultural curiosity, and required its employees to embrace a far-right political ideology. And although we faced losing my salary and career, our church family for over 20 years, and our beloved arts community, we summoned our moral courage and submitted our resignation on July 3rd, 2020. And we refused to sign a severance package due to extreme NDA restrictions. As painful as it was, we liberated ourselves from a coming storm that would leave many Americans and Christians shaking their heads at the rise of the Christian nationalism movement. And of course, a few months later was January 6th, and the church was regularly hosting Charlie Kirk rallies, the Awaken tour, if you remember that, with Michael Flynn.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've attended those. Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, as a protester or as a learner.
Yeah. Flashpoint, which you were talking about, the kind of Trump prophets. That is a group with like Lance Wallnau and Dutch Sheets, who are using kind of this MAGA ideology as their prophetic talking points, and
Yep.
it really rallies up the conservative base to embrace that as well. So the church is regularly continuing to host conspiracy theory conferences and that type of thing. So it wasn't just a one-off of like, hey, we're doing this one-off Trump thing, and
Right.
We'll not engage after that.
Do you think Luke Barnett, the pastor there, would self-identify as a Christian nationalist? Like, would he say, yeah, I'm a Christian nationalist? Or would he even try to say, that's not a term we use to self-describe?
That's a good question. I can't put words in his mouth, but from what I've seen and heard about them, they are very militant about engaging in culture wars.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that reflects not only like culture wars, like we want policy to follow our beliefs on that.
Yeah.
I'll read, this was a post from a prominent member of Dream City. They continue to host these conferences. She said, and her hashtag is the Barbie Patriot. So she is very much on this. She loves Charlie Kirk, follows her. I'll leave her name off of it. But she says, if you are a Christ follower, then you know the true history of conservative Christian worldview, and you will see the origin of interweaving of political principle from the beginning of time and all throughout the Bible. if you attend a church that isn't standing for the truth, capital T, in the very word of God that pertains to just about everything our culture is facing currently, then leave that church. There are plenty of courageous pastors out there who are confronting the battle and not afraid to do so. Dream City Church is one of those, and we'd be happy for you to have you. And then she says, I'm so proud to fight this culture war alongside of you. So they're
There it
in
is.
battle mode.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
fighting mode. They're not unapologetic about it. They're saying, this is our new mission. And they have pretty much kind of given the keys to their future to, Charlie Kirk and others who are, and as I've unpacked it, I've kind of gone, why? But I hate to say it, but I think a big motivating factor is money and power and influence.
Well, so here's what I wanted to ask you, because Kari Lake lost the election. Donald Trump lost the state. The state of Arizona is not becoming a defined Christian nation. Did you left, and other people, I imagine in your circle, I imagine some of the people who are involved in the big productions haven't found their way back there after reopening after COVID. But how's the attendance at the church? Is it thriving? Is it alive and well from what you know? Like, has it taken a hit? Did other people leave, or did people just say, well, I'm sorry to see the Stoddards left, but still our church, and don't agree with everything that, Pastor Barnett says, but we're gonna stick it out. How is it going? Because the political wins are clearly not in their favor. It's a losing proposition over and over and over. So what's going on?
I want to come back to that, because I've asked that same question, and there's actually a caveat in there that's pretty interesting, in my opinion. I think a lot of people left quietly who were on the margins and were like, oh yeah, don't agree with this. Didn't make a big stink. A few people did, and tried to. We decided not to make a big public stink at that time with it. We thought it may be interpreted as a he said, she said. That's like, oh, Luke's upset with Mark. Mark's upset with Luke. And we just didn't see any good outcome coming from that. So we decided to kind of lay low, and it was during COVID. So the church was technically shut down. So we weren't really producing anything. Obviously, live theater was not happening. So we kind of were able to disappear somewhat quietly. Yes, we had a lot of people reach out to us and be like, wow, we haven't seen you guys. What's going on? And we were able to kind of tell our story privately on a one-on-one basis with a lot. But as far as the church attendance, I think it has grown exponentially, which was very much of a concern of ours, of like, they tapped into a whole new pocket of people who are like, we're MAGA now. There's obviously it's a megachurch or a megachurch. So it's
nice.
It's a megachurch.
It's a megachurch. It's a megachurch.
So they've attracted a lot of people who obviously have the similar, and that's why this, I think, connection with Charlie Kirk became very important for them to find their new mission, find a whole new pocket of people who believe that, and a whole new funding stream, which gives me to the second point. You said to the effect, don't they feel like, wow, we've lost these last, few election cycles? Isn't our message kind of maybe not relevant? But there's a circular thinking in this movement, and in a lot of evangelical doctrine as well, is that when you are losing, it's because the enemy is coming after you. And that's exactly where you want to be. So if we're being quote unquote persecuted or marginalized, or our religious freedoms are being under attack, you see, the enemy is attacking us. We're exactly where God wants us to be, because there's a battle ahead. And that mentality is paramount for fundraising. So these groups use that as going the fear tactic of, if we're not in the battle, your children are going to lose their moral compass. Our education is going out, the to hell in a handbasket. All of these kind of messaging that if we don't fight these culture wars, the LGBTQ agenda is going to take over. The liberal woke mob is coming after you. And all of these, culture war things. So it's actually an ingenious way. Like, if we win, we win.
That's
If
right.
we
Heads I win,
lose,
tails
we
you lose.
win.
Yeah, that's right.
And if we lose bad,
It's the winner's way.
So it's actually kind of an interesting.
Well, I think
circular
that's what's interesting to me as well, right? Is that oftentimes churches that advocate these more exclusivist and that move from the narrative of it's us and them culture, society, which is one religious orientation. There's also an us versus them. So there's competition. Yeah. But then there's a third version, which this is really built on, which is it's us or them. And the and versus or continuum is really important. And these folks are built around or-isms, right? If we're not in control, then it's them and they will destroy us. They will harm. So there's a whole victim narrative. There's a thing that people who study how violent movements get started in extremism, and it always involves this move from versus narrative to it's us or them.
Yeah.
This thing was built around it, and it's actually modeled. We just did a conversation earlier today, which people have seen about the same time that this one's available. So if they haven't seen it already, it'll be available soon. But about an article in Religious News Service from last week about a person named Gerald L.K. Smith. He's the guy that built the huge Jesus statue down in the Ozarks. He was also the head of a thing called the Cross and the Flag movement, which was a Christian nationalist movement from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Died in 1976. It's MAGA from top to bottom from the 1920s and 30s. It's built around these same organizing principles. Like in some ways, these folks are doing the thing you do when you organize this kind of movement in America. They're doing it on par with the other movements that have also awakened in the country, have failed politically, but never had a thing like Donald Trump to count as a win. And frankly, the Trumpism has changed the narrative because you had a full-on supporter of all of this as the president of the United States and in charge of the executive branch, and then people in charge of the Justice Department and all the appointments that a president can make, including now the Supreme Court. So yeah, it is really, really something. And I worry that the losing streak will break and they'll win, and that someone like Carrie Lake and others who, again, might be very fine people. I don't know, but I know that the political position that they're taking is not fine. It's not reasonable. It's not in the spirit with, America does fine when it's an and it does fine when it's a us versus them narrative. We've figured out how to live that way. It doesn't work when it's us or them narrative that's happening. And this whole thing is built around that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I agree with that completely. My wife and I were politically aware, but not really politically active until this thing kind of knocked on our door and we were like, oh, what do we do with this? And we kind of had to, obey our conscience where we're like, wow, we literally cannot continue to work or worship in this environment anymore. But I also have a counter to this. I think, and you probably wrestle with this regularly and probably have addressed it, like, how do you not villainize and demonize people who embrace this ideology? Because that's a challenge for me now. Of I would consider Luke's wife Angel she was probably one of my closest friends. And then when this Charlie Kirk thing happened, the Trump and the new direction, I don't recognize her anymore. We've had no contact, since then. But I miss our friendship,
Yeah.
and I'm like, they also are doing like good work in the community with other things. So it's not just like they're completely bad people or anything.
Yep.
So I wrestle with that all the time, and I'm like, I don't want to villainize Dream City Church and the Barnetts of being, see, these are the covert, enemies of our
That's right.
society. It's like they're just trying to do the best they can too, I guess.
Well,
trying to
regular
extend-
listeners to this world are going to be like, Doug's about to go on his hero, villain, victim narrative thing, which I'm going to do. But there is this tendency in American culture and in human civilization to have three characters only: heroes, villains, and victims. And rarely does anyone identify with the villain. Even if you do horrible things, somehow you're the victim or the hero.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for us, but it's prominent. Another narrative that a lot of traditions, religious traditions and cultural traditions call us to is a sojourn narrative. We're traveling together into new places. There's a new world we're living in now. And we need each other, and we're all going to do heroic things. We're all going to do villainous things. We're all going to be harmed and helped by the behaviors of others. So we're in this thing together, right? There's that narrative. That's actually what, for me, the Christian tradition that I know well, which, has its roots in Judaism and so on, there's these stories and tales that are meant to remind us of this stuff. You can't barely get started in the book of Genesis. You're not into it for 2 chapters before a brother kills his brother, right? Like the Son of God has 2 sons in this story, and one of them kills the other. So you can blame it on a lot of things, right, is what the tradition is supposed to be saying. But whatever situation you're in, there's like, it was here before you. So don't try to lay the blame there. Or then you have the tales all the way through the Jewish text of family member turning on family members. So tribe isn't even enough. And we know in modern day that thinking, well, we're in the same family or we're all in this thing together, most violence that's done in America is done among people who know each other and love each other and often are related to each other.
Yeah.
So these are not narratives that you get to easily. And then you think Jesus has 12 disciples. Well, 3 of them, one's a denier, one's a betrayer, and one's a doubter, right? So you just begin to realize, okay, what we're not going to do is purify the ranks. We're not going to ever have a time where everyone's in this thing together. But we do have to find a way to call out harm, to call people to a better life, to recognize that even our brothers and sisters are the ones who can be turning on us, but not to degrade the sense of we're part of the family of God together, the human family of God, right? We're all part of this thing together. And there's all kinds of mistakes. We were on a chat here the other day and someone said, we're talking about how we think Ron DeSantis would be a really problematic person to be the executive of the executive branch, and someone wrote, he's a dirty pig. And like, okay, that language, that's dehumanizing language, right?
Yeah.
Like there are just things you do to not villainize the other and still call out the fact that what they're doing is terrible. We do some work in anti-death penalty work, which puts you in proximity to people on death row. And a lot of people executed on death row are not being executed as innocent people. They admit to their guilt. So how do you deal with someone who's done barbaric things and yet you don't dehumanize them? You recognize their humanity, you recognize the friendship, for you of Angel and of others. And right, it's this and world. It's us and you. We're in opposition and we're together. And boy, I'll tell you, Mark, I don't know. That's why you telling your story is so helpful, because everyone who's come to these realizations with each other and their families just realizes like it's complicated. I was part of it for a long time. Some of it I agreed with, some of it I didn't. Sometimes I stayed silent. I bet you've laid around in bed or early in the mornings when you should be sleeping, and yet your mind decided to wake you up with a reminder of what you did or didn't do and tells you, hey, you shoulda, coulda, woulda, right? And that doesn't do any good. So we all have to come to grips with ourselves, and our traditions should help us to do that. They shouldn't blind our eyes. They should open our eyes.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I know that's a little preachy, but that really is the
No,
struggle.
it is. Yeah. And I noticed I don't follow Dream City at all pretty much lately, but I noticed in the time period about the Trump rally and, when we left, I'm going to say the vast majority of messaging came from Old Testament ideas. It was about battles. It was about fights. It was about not bowing your knee to whatever. But there was very little messaging about the Good Samaritan or the Golden Rule or some of the teachings of Jesus, which I found very interesting because they were about, hey, we're in a fight here. We got to battle for this to keep our status quo, type of thing. That was a little disturbing with it. And it goes back to this idea that you mentioned that there's an or. It's either going to be David or Goliath. We cannot live with both of these archetypes at the same time. Well, what if we ever looked at that story from Goliath's standpoint? Goliath and the Philistines probably had an interesting narrative about that if it actually ever happened, event type of thing of going, maybe we need to consider, an alternate point of view with that it's not complete good against complete evil. There's so much kind of the nuances of that. And I think that gets, where the danger happens is when we say it is completely black and white and we're on the right side of history.
Totally. And look, you take the Jewish text and hang around with any Jewish rabbi, and they will tell you so many of the passages and stories that Christians take to create a story that they want to follow were written as warning narratives. This is the thing that we don't even understand. People, and I get it, it's easy to just go after the Old Testament and stuff because people have been mistaught it from the time they were children and over. But so many of those stories, like the ones you mentioned, a David and Goliath story or a Jonah story. I mean, Jonah is like, I want them all to die. And the whole story is what a fool he is, right? The Esther story, these folks love to quote Esther, but Esther is a warning narrative about Esther leading a slaughter on the day of Purim on 2 different days of her enemies. And we can never do that again. The story of Cain and Abel are warning narratives. Like these stories exist, but they're told in a way so that people will say, may we never do that again. And instead, these folks pick these stories, Jericho marches and other things, and they act as if it's the point. It would be like taking the temptation of Jesus narrative and saying like, well, the tempter had a real point there. I would have taken that deal. Like, no, you're not supposed to take that deal. Even when the text is used, it's not as if a reader of the text is supposed to be saying like, well, I don't know, are we kind of living, which God's in control now? The point was that call to live a militarized life. That's why the prophets come along and say, how many sacrifices do you want? How much bloodshed can there possibly be, whether it's in the temple or on the battlefield? But I'll tell you what the Lord God requires of you, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly. That's the counter to those stories. So this is the part as a biblical theologian and pastor that just drives me crazy about people picking these Old Testament passages is you literally miss the point. Like you inverted, you Freaky Friday'd that story in such a way that you think you're supposed to go out and have a raging battle. With like the prophets don't say anything in this story about how long will the nations rage? How long will the fruitless, when will we pound the swords into plowshares, right? Like instead, the story just gets reworked and reworked and reworked. I mean, and it's going to happen again in 2 weeks or 3 weeks when Easter comes around. Someone at one of these churches is going to say, it's a good thing that God killed his son because look what we got out of the deal. Which is the opposite of the point of the crucifixion of Jesus. It is that even in a political, a religious system, what will it do? It will ultimately even kill the very Son of God. That's the story. And instead they'll be like, Good deal for us. Got our sins forgiven. Hallelujah. And we move on. Like, it can't just from top to bottom, from Genesis to Gospel of John to the book of Revelation, it's just backward. And Christian people who stay silent or don't know this stuff, either way, are benefited by a little waking up and speaking up and standing up to these issues, because it's not serving anyone well. Vengeance is not the thing we are supposed to be unleashing on one another. And I say that to my political friends who agree with my positions too, who really would prefer that people who hold the Christian nationalism stop existing. They don't want to kill them or anything. They just want them to go away. Yeah. They're not going to go away. You're going to have to deal with them and help that perspective change, because they don't just magically disappear. Yeah. And I think I appreciate that about what you guys are doing, is continuing to look at, we're all in this together. We're going to have our different religious and ideological viewpoints about culture and religion, and but we all have to coexist here. How can we coexist? And when it comes to public policy, how can we create the best common good for us to exist in? I had a little aha moment yesterday. We were driving with my wife and I was sitting at a four-way cross, in the car, waiting at a red light. And I was thinking, there's a social contract all of these cars have decided to abide by, that we're actually going to pay attention to the light. So I'm going to wait for my green arrow to turn. But I thought, you know what? What if I didn't? What if I said, I want to go now? I want my way now. There's immediate danger that would happen to me and whoever I run into. So that prevents us from going, okay, I'm not going to do that. And I think, our political landscape is at a crossroads too, so to speak, of going, are we going to be able to back off a little bit and go, I'm willing to relinquish my power or my privilege in order to figure out a better landscape for all of us to abide by. And I think that's the danger of an organization like a Turning Point USA and stuff, who is going, no, we're going to win, and there will be a loser. And and the church is embracing this. I was going to show you real quick. Arizona Republic did a series of articles on Turning Point USA. This was headlines about the hostile takeover of the GOP. And Turning Point USA being, a big part of that. I was a part of another article that they did about Turning Point Faith, and a local pastor who had been attending those and seeing just the kind of antithetical message to what the Christian faith was for it. So I'd love to see that article. I'd like to interview that guy. Yeah, I'd love to chat with him.
I'll put you in touch. And there's a reporter at the Republic who's been doing an ongoing series about Turning Point and Dream City and about their involvement in.
Because to borrow your metaphor, what the Turning Point people believe they're doing, they don't believe they're running red lights, right? It's not their narrative for themselves. Their self-talk is, we are emergency vehicles because we're Christians. So we are granted privilege. We are granted permission to not obey those traffic lights because we have a different authority. As soon as a fire truck or ambulance or police vehicle turns on their lights, everybody pulls over, and you expect they're just going to go right through. This is how they view it. They're like, we have another calling that gives us carte blanche to do whatever we want to do. The rest of you people have to wait, but we're in charge of society. This is where that narrative goes, right? Is they'll always come up with a reason why they're not breaking the rules. They're never the villain. They're always the hero. And they're doing the heroic thing. And we wish we didn't have to. Like, we don't want to run around with our lights on, but it's a good thing we have them because it's important. Yeah. So when they raid the Capitol on January 6th, they're like, no, we're the patriots. We were stopping an evil. We weren't perpetrating an evil. People are like, no, you're not. Like you're self-appointed vigilantes that don't. And this is an argument that we need to have in our society and need to have it pretty forthrightly. But if you believe that people think they're doing something wrong and getting away with it, you've missed their own story. They believe they're doing something right and are not being allowed to do it. That's the story that they're telling.
Yeah.
And this is the really hard. This is where, all the family therapy work and everything that people do, because families that hurt one another, it's amazing what they say to each other. Like, no, I wasn't the, there was that thing, but like it's really something. It's a regular routine that people go through in their, in these kinds of circumstances. And look, we're an and organization for sure. But we have this little line that, we like, where I'm like, look, every person is the beloved child of God. Donald Trump, beloved child of God. Nothing he can do to earn or lose the love of God. He's the light of the world and the salt of the earth. But not every light of the world should be the president of the United States. And being loved by God and being fully accepted as a human being doesn't qualify you to be in that role. And this guy needs to never be president of the United States again, right? It's kind of a fun way for us to describe that. It's also an operating principle that, yes, there's inclusion. Yes, everyone should be involved. But truly, not every idea is a good one. Not every person should take their ideas and give it the full weight of the government or the full work of your organization. So inclusion and acceptance doesn't mean you don't stand up to things, and doesn't mean you don't, move in the right direction. So I just think this is the really hard work that we all have to do. Yeah. And it's maturing work. Like, it takes you a while to realize, okay, our job here is not to purify the country. Our job here is to find a way to move together and live together. And the common good, for us at least, it seems like, hey, that's a pretty good one. Is it the most good for the most people most of the time? Well, nothing about Christian nationalism says it is. It just doesn't work that way. Well, super preachy today. Sorry about all that. And thanks for all your time.
Yeah, appreciate that. I just want to give a shout out to any artists who are out there that need to be creating material that is bringing a light to this. Because stories and art are incredibly influential. And whether they're filmmakers or theater makers or musicians that are creating narratives and stories to look at the world in a different way. And so I hope that they're out there and doing work, to change hearts and minds, to consider other ways of doing that. So thank you for, and we're just kind of a blip on the screen. We're kind of collateral damage to the Christian nationalist movement, and got hit at the intersection, and now we're kind of gathering our way. And so thanks for organizations like you and Rob Shank.
You are sure welcome. Well, and thank you for being public and being honest and telling your story. It really does a lot.
Great. Well, thanks, Doug. Appreciate it.
Hi, Mark. We'll see you soon. Hey, we'll talk to you soon here on the podcast too.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a great day.